Burmese pythons have devastated native wildlife in the Everglades.
New footage shot inside the Florida Everglades is making scientists, hunters, and wildlife officials question everything they thought they knew about one of the worst invasive species disasters in American history. For more than 20 years, the Everglades story moved in one direction only. Burmese pythons showed up, native animals vanished, and the swamp got quieter year after year. But what trail cameras and field researchers are now capturing is pushing back against that narrative, and it's raising a question almost nobody expected to ask in 2026. Is the Everglades actually starting to fight back? To get why this matters, you need to go back to the beginning. The Everglades isn't just a swamp. It's one of the most important wetlands on Earth, a slow-moving river of grass that stretches across South Florida, filtering drinking water for millions of people, soaking up storm surge, and holding together an incredibly complex web of life. Alligators dominated the waterways. Raccoons, opossums, bobcats, marsh rabbits, and wading birds moved through in what seemed like endless numbers. That balance held for thousands of years. Then, in August 1992, Hurricane Andrew slammed into South Florida as a Category 5 storm with winds topping 165 miles per hour. Homes were leveled, and so were a number of exotic animal breeding and import facilities near Miami. Burmese pythons, native to Southeast Asia, escaped into the wetlands in the chaos that followed. But the hurricane was only half the story. Through the 80s and 90s, Burmese pythons had become a popular exotic pet. They were cheap, easy to grab at reptile expos, and as babies they looked harmless enough to hold in one hand. Most buyers had no idea that within a few years that same snake could stretch past 10 feet and weigh over 50 pounds. When owners couldn't handle them anymore, plenty just let them loose, often right at the edge of the Everglades, thinking they were being kind. In reality, they were dropping an apex predator into an ecosystem that had zero evolutionary defenses against it. Burmese pythons are built for ambush hunting. Their patterned scales disappear into dead grass and dark water. Heat-sensing pits along their jaws let them track warm-blooded prey in pitch darkness. They can stay submerged for long stretches without coming up for air. A single female can lay up to 100 eggs at once, and with no natural predator keeping them in check, their numbers exploded. Wildlife agencies now estimate anywhere from 100,000 to several 100,000 Burmese pythons are spread across South Florida. The proof of the damage came from years of field research, most notably a widely referenced study by biologists Michael Dorcas and John Wilson, which tracked mammal sightings along Everglades roadways before and after the pythons arrived. In the areas hit hardest, raccoon sightings dropped over 99%. Opossum numbers fell almost 98%. Bobcats declined sharply, and marsh rabbits and foxes became nearly impossible to spot in some survey areas. This wasn't a slow fade. It was closer to a wipeout. Researchers who'd spent decades in the Everglades described driving for miles at night without seeing a single small mammal cross the road in spots where wildlife used to be everywhere. Florida's response to all this got increasingly public and increasingly desperate. The Florida Python Challenge, an annual hunt offering cash prizes for the most pythons caught, made national news. But the real numbers tell a different story. In recent years, the total catch for the whole competition has landed only in the low hundreds, a tiny fraction of the estimated population. Since 2017, the South Florida Water Management District's paid removal program, which keeps contracted hunters working year-round, has pulled more than 20,000 pythons off public land. That sounds like a lot until you compare it to a population in the hundreds of thousands. The real problem was never effort. It was the animal itself. Thermal drones, one of the most promising tools tried, struggled badly because pythons are cold-blooded, and the swamp's ambient temperature often matches their body heat, making them practically invisible to thermal cameras. Mechanical lures and decoys flop too, since pythons ambush rather than chase. The technique that's actually worked best is what researchers call the Judas snake method, fitting a captured python with a radio tracker, releasing it during breeding season, and letting it lead scientists to other pythons nearby. It works, but not nearly at the scale needed to meaningfully shrink the population. Works, but not nearly at the scale needed to meaningfully shrink the population. That's when field researchers started noticing something that made the whole situation even messier. Dr. Ian Bartoshik and his team at the Conservancy of Southwest Florida, who've spent years tracking radio-tagged pythons through Big Cypress National Preserve, documented a shift in python behavior over several seasons. Spots that used to be reliable hunting grounds started going cold, not because the snakes had vanished, but because the survivors seemed to be steering clear of areas with heavy human activity. Maybe individual snakes were learning to dodge detection, or maybe something more unsettling was happening. Natural selection at work, with the most cautious, hard-to-spot snakes surviving while the bolder ones kept getting caught. Either way, the conclusion was the same. An already elusive predator was becoming even harder to find. While everyone was focused on python numbers, a second, much quieter threat was spreading through the swamp. Dr. Cristina Romagosa, a research scientist at the University of Florida's Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences, has spent years studying a parasite called Relietina orientalis, better known as snake lungworm. It's native to Southeast Asia and arrived in Florida the same way the pythons did, but it spread in ways researchers didn't see coming. Burmese pythons can carry the lungworm without much trouble, since their bodies evolved alongside it for thousands of years. Florida's native snakes have no such immunity. The infection cycle is grim in how simple it is. An infected python releases waste loaded with parasite eggs into swamp water. Cockroaches and other invertebrates eat that waste and pick up the larvae. Frogs eat the infected bugs, and native snakes eat the frogs. Once inside a native snake, the larvae work their way out of the gut, through tissue and into the lungs, where they latch on, feed, and multiply. Romagosa's research has documented infected native snakes dealing with serious breathing problems, weight loss, and in bad cases, dying of suffocation as their lungs fill up with parasites. At least 18 native snake species have now tested positive, and confirmed cases have shown up well north of the original python territory, stretching toward Jacksonville. Even more worrying, researchers have confirmed the parasite is now spreading between native snakes on its own without pythons involved at all. Which means even if every python in Florida disappeared tomorrow, the lungworm would still be here and still spreading. In the middle of all this, one detail caught researchers off guard. The Florida cottonmouth, a venomous pit viper living in the very same infected wetlands, has tested completely clean across multiple surveys. No lungworm at all, even in the worst-hit areas. Nobody knows why yet. It could be tied to immune response, blood chemistry, or some other biological factor nobody's identified. But the implications are big. If scientists can figure out what's protecting the cottonmouth, that discovery might eventually help shield other native species from the same parasite. While that mystery sits unsolved, Florida wildlife officials made a move that struck a lot of people as backwards at first. They started releasing more snakes into protected habitat. But this wasn't another invasive species. It was the Eastern Indigo Snake, the longest native snake in North America. Capable of growing past 8 feet, with a glossy blue-black body and a reputation as one of the best natural predators of venomous snakes in the region. Unlike the python, the Eastern Indigo doesn't constrict its prey. It overpowers smaller animals with raw jaw strength, and it's largely immune to the venom of native pit vipers like rattlesnakes and cottonmouths. The Eastern Indigo didn't vanish because some other predator beat it. It vanished because its home was destroyed. These snakes rely heavily on gopher tortoise burrows for shelter and to regulate their body temperature. As longleaf pine forest and scrub habitat across North Florida got cleared for development, gopher tortoise numbers crashed and the indigo snake population went down right along with them. By the late 1970s, eastern indigo snakes were basically extinct across much of North Florida. For decades, conservation groups, including the Central Florida Zoo's reintroduction program working with the Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines Preserve, pushed to undo that damage through captive breeding, habitat restoration, and carefully reintroducing both indigo snakes and gopher tortoises. In late 2023, that decades-long effort hit a milestone researchers had been waiting 50 years for. Trail cameras caught footage of wild-born Eastern Indigo hatchlings moving through restored habitat in North Florida, the first confirmed case of the species reproducing in the wild in the region in roughly half a century. For the biologists who'd poured years into this project, it confirmed something huge. A native apex predator wasn't just surviving on reintroduced animals, it was successfully breeding on its own. Around the same time, researchers tracking radio-tagged pythons further south recorded something rare that had never been formally confirmed before. A tagged python in Big Cypress National Preserve turned up dead, killed by a native bobcat roughly half its size. Trail cameras in the area also caught other predator activity. Alligators going after smaller pythons, and native predators targeting pythons at vulnerable moments, especially right after a big meal when the snakes are sluggish and less able to defend themselves. None of this means native wildlife is winning the bigger fight. Pythons still massively outnumber anything capable of challenging them. But it does suggest the relationship between this invasive predator and native wildlife isn't a complete one-way street anymore. All of these threads are now coming together toward an outcome nobody can call for sure. Python populations keep pushing north along waterways and warming habitat corridors. Eastern indigo populations are slowly spreading outward from restored habitat up north. Their territories are drifting toward each other, and at some point they'll likely overlap. Meanwhile, the lungworm parasite is also creeping north, raising the possibility that indigo snakes could run into it before anyone knows whether the species has any natural resistance. What this new footage from Florida really shows isn't a clean win or a final collapse. It shows an ecosystem still under massive strain, still dealing with an invasive predator numbering in the hundreds of thousands, still facing a self-sustaining parasite with no easy fix. But it also shows something the Everglades hasn't shown in over 20 years. Real evidence that native wildlife is adapting, bouncing back, and in some cases, pushing back. Bobcats are killing pythons. Eastern indigo snakes are reproducing in the wild for the first time in 50 years. And researchers are still chasing down the secret behind the cottonmouth's resistance to a parasite that's already devastated other native species. Nobody studying this crisis is calling it solved. But for the first time in a long time, it doesn't look like a one-sided story anymore. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Nature Mystery Unravel Mysteries. Learn untold tales of history and stay in the exciting world of new discoveries.